I'm Angeline Lillard, and I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia. And one of the major areas that I study is Montessori education. And I got into this because for several reasons, but when my children were young, they were going to Montessori, and sometimes I was uncomfortable with what was happening in their classrooms, and so I would go and ask people who know a lot about Montessori, what was going on here, and they would tell me that, in fact, when I didn't like what was happening in the classrooms, it was because teachers were changing it and making it more like conventional education, often under pressure from parents. And when I did like what they were doing, because it very much corresponded with the psychology and the education research on what's good for human development, then they were doing what Montessori said. And so I got deeper and deeper into reading Montessori's books and saw all these points of connection where many of the things that she observed, she was one of the first women to become a physician in Italy around the turn of the last century. And she had developed this system for how to help children's development. It's considered a school system, but it's really considered an aid to life by her and her followers. It corresponds much more closely to what we know about human development than what we do in conventional education. So I started noticing all these points of convergence, and I wrote this book, Montessori, The Science Behind the Genius. This is the third edition, so that I could tell teachers of Montessori about this interesting research that supports what they were already doing, but also so I could tell people in conventional education who often are coming up with new programs to try to make conventional education better, that actually Montessori already does a lot of those things and so many more things that correspond with how people learn and develop the best. So, for example, the first chapter of the book is about movement and cognition, and there's so much research showing that people think better and learn better when they're able to move in ways that correspond with what they're learning. So one little example of this would be a study where children saw an object hidden under one of two different cloths. And then in some trials they could crawl to the cloth to get the toy, and in other trials their mother carried them to the cloth at the same pace that they crawled. And what they found was that on that first trial, almost all the babies found the toy under the correct cloth immediately when they could crawl, but only 1 out of 26 found it when their mother carried them. And there's just so much more research that I talk about in the book that shows that we think better when we move. And Montessori saw that, and so she set up the entire classroom around children doing things with their bodies. So children develop in Montessori by concentrating deeply on meaningful and challenging activities that employ the body in the service of the mind. My book talks about several other principles: not having extrinsic rewards, basing interest on learning, which is easy to do in an individual setup but hard to do in a whole class, where you're teaching everybody the same thing. Children learn really well from their peers. Children do best when an environment is very orderly, and so on. But when I finished the book, I decided, gee, if school could ever make a difference for children, then children who go to Montessori schools should be doing much better. And the reason that's a question is because there's a lot of research showing that parents are really what make the difference. That if you take parents out of the equation, children, it wouldn't matter where they go to school. And part of that is that parents choose the schools. So the first study that I did after I finished the first edition of the book in 2005, I used children who had won or lost a lottery to get into public Montessori in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And we followed the children who were waitlisted, who hadn't gotten in, and were at a variety of different schools, and children who had won the lottery and gotten into the Montessori. And we found that on every measure that we looked at, the children in Montessori either did better or just the same. Most measures, particularly at 5, they did better. At 12, they did better on some really key things. So fast forward, I just had a study come out in Frontiers in Psychology where we followed a much larger group of children at the Hartford Montessori public magnet schools. and compared them to lottery losers to those. And although children, when they were 3 and they were just starting Montessori or whatever other school they went to, looked just the same, after 3 years in Montessori preschool, the ones who were in Montessori were doing much better than the ones at other schools. And also, what was especially compelling was the low-income children who were in non-Montessori schools were doing worse every year relative to the others, whereas the low-income children in Montessori were doing better each year, such that by the end of the study, they were no longer significantly different from the high-income children at the conventional schools or the high-income children at the Montessori schools. And so my sense is that if many more children could be in Montessori, we would have better academic outcomes. But what I think is even more important is all the soft skills and all of the other ways that children can develop. And again, my research shows that Montessori as an aid to life is much more helpful for helping children to develop into capable and confident and empathetic and kind, hardworking, persistent human beings.